Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute's virtual event series. To fulfill President Reagan's mission of making the Reagan Library a dynamic intellectual forum, our Center for Public Affairs Programming offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day. Each year, we bring you 20 to 30 events from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. Since the March 2020 closure of many businesses across our great country, the Reagan Foundation is now bringing its events online to ensure that we are still delivering world-class content, even if you can't get to our hilltop to watch it in person.
About 2 years ago, we heard the news that Martha MacCallum, the talented anchor and show host at Fox News, was possibly writing a book. That fact caught our eye because we are always on the lookout for authors of important new books who can join us for our speaker series at the Reagan Library. So needless to say, we were really pleased when we learned that it was true. Martha was in the thick of writing what was certain to be a best-selling book, one that was about the heroism of American soldiers during the Battle of Iwo Jima. Then fortune smiled on us. Martha agreed to join us at the Reagan Library to discuss her book. Of course, at the time we booked Martha to come almost exactly a year ago, little did we know that just a few days before she was to come, the coronavirus pandemic was going to strike. And in the wake of the pandemic, we were forced to close the Reagan Library and cancel all of our events, including our visit with Martha. I'm not exaggerating when I say we had to disappoint over 1,000 people who were eager to come to the Reagan Library to see her. Now, here we are a full year later. The bad news is that the virus is still with us. But the good news is that during all this time, the Reagan Foundation developed the ability to go digital. We moved our speaker series online and began producing quality programming for our social media channels in a new and better format. Tens of thousands of our supporters have been tuning in to the virtual events we're bringing you, now sometimes 2 to 3 times a week. This week, we are just thrilled to host our long-awaited event with Martha to discuss her book. It's entitled Unknown Valor, a story of family, courage, and sacrifice from Pearl Harbor to Iwo Jima. It's just now coming out in paperback. To all of our guests who reserved seats for the original event we had scheduled with Martha a year ago, I have some great news. Joining Martha in conversation today about her new book is another truly remarkable woman, her fellow Fox News host and best-selling author herself, Dana Perino. I cannot say enough about Dana. We are just blessed to have her with us today to interview Martha. 2 weeks from now, we will turn the table. For that program, Martha MacCallum hosts a conversation with Dana Perino for Dana's new book titled Everything Will Be Okay. But today, it's Martha's turn, and we couldn't be more excited. Let's join in their conversation.
Welcome to this book interview with author and friend of mine, Martha MacCallum. She, of course, is anchor of The Story on Fox News. And this is her book, Unknown Valor. It is an amazing read. It came out in February of 2020. We're going to talk about all of that. The paper book is out and available now. You'll want to check that out. This is the subtitle, A Story of Family, Courage, and Sacrifice from Pearl Harbor to Iwo Jima. Those of you who know me know that I love books. I read every word of this book, Martha. I loved it. It's one of the books that has stayed with me the most that I have read in recent years.
Thank you. And thank you for talking with me, Dana. You and I love to talk about books, and you were so helpful to me when I was writing this book. In fact, Dana was the very first person that I gave it to read it, and she was so kind. She went right through it right away and came back with some notes. I mean, you are absolutely the person that everybody would want to do that because you're so thoughtful.
We're
in your
trusted
process.
early readers here. So, okay, let's go back to set the stage for everybody for how did you decide to write this book and the personal connection you have to it?
I actually was grateful to the editor because when we started talking about writing a book, I started telling him this story about being a little girl and going up into my grandfather's attic and finding these letters that had been written by my mother's first cousin, Harry Gray, who was killed at Iwo Jima when he was 18. And from a young age, when I would read these letters, they moved me to tears. And I thought, if I'm going to put the time into writing a book, I want it to be a book that's about something that I'm going to learn a ton researching. And I spent the next 3 years researching Iwo Jima, learning about the battle, traveling to Iwo Jima, and just sort of immersing myself in this one battle from the Pacific from World War II. And I learned so much about Harry. And not only that, I ended up learning a lot about the men who were there with him.
Tell me a little bit about Harry.
So he was 18 years old from Arlington, Massachusetts. His father died when he was 12, so he quickly became sort of the young man of the house. He was very close to his sister and his mother. His mother was my Grandpa Bo's, his sister, and we were all very close. We have a pretty small family, so I grew up knowing her very well, and I always wondered about the loss that she suffered, losing her husband at a young age and then her son, which was an absolute heartbreaking loss that sort of reverberated through my family. And even as a little kid, my mom, who was very close to her cousin Harry, adored him. He was like a big brother to her. And losing him was something that stayed with her for the rest of her life. And as a child, I didn't understand the magnitude of it. You don't really feel those things as when you're little. But the older I got and the more I dug into the letters, the more I realized why this was such a huge part of her life and of her family's life. The
way that you structure the book is you have the story of the Battle of Iwo Jima, the build up to the fight in the Pacific, but you intersperse that with stories that you remember from your childhood or that you researched and learned. And if you wouldn't mind telling everybody, like one of the stories that sticks with me so much is when they find out that Pearl Harbor has been bombed.
Yeah, I remember my mom telling me as a kid about that day. And she said we went to church, and then afterwards we were so excited, she and another little girl, family friend, that they got to go to Howard Johnson's and have hot chocolate. And she said we were sitting in the booth and it had just arrived, with whipped cream on top, and she could smell it, and it was so, and she was stirring it to cool it off. And then she heard something crackling on the radio, and suddenly all the adults in the room got nervous and started standing up and putting their coats on. And she remembered her mother grabbing her by her wrist. Come on, Betty, we got to go. We got to go. Like, all hell is breaking loose. The world has just changed in an instant. And she didn't know what was going on, but she remembered that moment for the rest of her life. And of course, that changed everything because all of the young men that they knew, including Harry, he would go a couple of years later because he went to the Pacific. It changed our lives forever.
And so Harry's uncle, that's your grandfather.
Yes.
So he mapped the battle in the basement. Tell me about that and how he carefully looked at all of the newspaper articles and was trying to figure out where is Harry now.
Well, that was one of the things that I first discovered in my grandparents' attic were all of these perfectly pressed newspapers, and he kept the big headlines from all of the major battles, and he would go through them all, and in those newspapers there were these maps. So he had them on a wall, and he had little pins in them, and he was following it. He really did not want Harry to go. He felt strongly that the war was going to be ending fairly soon, and he sort of hoped that that cup could just pass him by as an 18-year-old who hadn't left yet, in 1944. But Harry was, just bound and determined to go, like all young men then. He wanted to serve his country. He wanted the adventure that he thought he was going to have there.
And he left behind a girlfriend.
He did.
And her name?
Her name was Dorothy. She was called Dot, and he loved her very much. It was a real teenage love story, and I know that because of the men that I met through writing this story who were with him. George Coburn and Charlie Gubish, when I met them independently, both confirmed. They said, oh yeah, he had a really serious girlfriend at home. He wanted to marry her. And in one of the letters that I read, he says at the end of it, it's almost Easter, Mom, would you please buy Dot a corsage? I'll pay you back for it when I get home. It's a a heartbreaking story of young love. He wanted to marry her before he left home, but that didn't happen.
So then tell me a little bit also about working with Ronald Dres, who is a historian, and he helps to tell the story in a lot of detail, but to the point where it kept my interest the entire time.
So we go through the battles of the Pacific, and Ron was a captain in Vietnam. He's also a war historian, and he and I traveled together to Iwo Jima. He knows the battle inside and out. And I wanted to be sure that it was militarily sound, the way that we were writing about all of these battles. And he did a masterful job of retelling a lot of these battles in Tarawa and Guadalcanal in a way that, rings true to both veterans and people who were there, and then also, regular people who are just learning about these stories for the first time. So he was absolutely integral in making sure that it was, as I say, militarily sound. And, I worked hard to make sure that it was accessible to people like me.
Do you, maybe this is just me, but I might have actually even heard you say this. I feel like I have read a lot about World War II in Europe. Both from a nonfiction perspective and a ton of fiction. That's a great genre for me. I love historical fiction of that period. But there's not as much written about the Pacific.
There isn't. And I think one of the reasons is that it's far away. People, the islands sort of all look the same to people that weren't there. They all actually look a little bit different when you're on them. And people had a familiarity with Europe. They understood Churchill. They understood, when the bombs were dropping on St. Paul's in London. I mean, that was something, those were images that people were familiar with. It was devastating to see Hitler marching down the Champs-Élysées. I mean, it made people wonder, is that going to happen on Fifth Avenue in New York City? And it well could have. Yeah. I mean, that's where this was headed. But the Pacific was just a darker, more mysterious place. I think there was a lower understanding of Emperor Hirohito. And news traveled more slowly. So, all of these stories took a while to get back home. But it's become, just a great interest of mine. I think the Pacific is a great series for anybody who wants to learn more about this period. And it sort of was a starting point for me to just get that visual on what it all looked like. It's a wonderful.
So you have a documentary that you did about the book, Unknown Valor, and I loved it. One of the things I love, though, I love these personal stories. So in your research, you find and you were able to talk to veterans that served with Harry.
Yeah, which was amazing. I mean, there were 60,000 Marines on Iwo Jima, and I never expected that I would find two people, not just one, but two, who were with him that day. And one of them was his dear friend, George Coburn, who I thought I wasn't going to find. I had tried to find him, and I had Marine records for all of the guys in the book, and I had poured through, their injury, the documentation of their injuries, everything, and I couldn't find anything else on George Coburn. And towards the very end of writing the book, it was just bothering me so much because there's a scene when they go swimming at Eniwetok on the beach, and it's like a beach party. It's a little break. They'd been cooped up on the Rochambeau on the transit ship across the Pacific, and the leadership says, you know what, guys, go have fun, jump in the water, and have a little fun. And it was a moment that was written about by George Coburn as he wrote a letter after Harry died to my aunt and explained, Harry and I went swimming on Eniwetok. He was my best friend, all of this. And so it was just driving me crazy that I was writing about this moment, this beach party, and trying to piece it together based on what I knew. I wish I could talk to George. And so I went back through his file again, and I found a document that I had never seen before. Or I'd come across it, I'm sure, but I never focused on it. And it was a request for his military discharge papers, but it was written from Melbourne, Florida, after he moved from Massachusetts. And it had a more recent address for him that I had never seen before. So I immediately started searching obituaries in Melbourne, Florida, George Coburn, to see if I could find him, because I knew he was in his 90s. And I couldn't find one. So working with another friend of mine, Dean Lawback, who's a great researcher who helped me a lot, by 9 o'clock the next morning, we were on the phone with George.
Wow.
And when we called him, I said, George, this is Martha MacCallum. I said, I'm Harry Gray's grandniece. And there was just this long silence. And he said to me, Martha, I think about Harry every day. He said he was my best friend, and and he started to cry on the phone. And his wife got upset, in the background. She said, George, they have a great Boston accent, just like my grandfather. And the whole time she said, Judge, don't talk about it anymore, And she said, he has to go. And then I felt terrible, that maybe we had upset him. But we reconnected a couple days later. And he is just one of the most wonderful men I've ever met. He is one of the kindest people I've ever met. And he was, just like so many of these men, he said, I've often thought that Harry would have lived a better life than I did. And it's just not true. And George has lived an amazing life. He has a beautiful family that I got to meet through this. And I think when they all watch this clip at the end, you're going to meet George a little bit yourself. And you'll see that he's a really special man.
So I'm holding this. Martha brought back, my grandfather on my father's side fought in the Pacific as well. And you brought back some sand from Iwo Jima. That trip was not easy to put together or pull off. I think it only happens once a year or so. Tell us a little bit about going there, and you were able to bring back a little something for those of us who had family there that served. But going there, what was that like?
It's quite a trip. You have to get a visa because I was working there. I was doing research, so I had to get a visa to go to Tokyo and then to Iwo Jima. It's only available for reporters and family members 1 day a year. They open the island for about 6 hours, one afternoon. There's 2 United flights that go, and they basically transit everybody all together as a group. It's some of the people that I went with were veterans who were going back to the island for the first time in their lives. It was very, very emotional for them. One group I remember was, with his son and his grandson, the 3 of them traveling together. And he told me amazing stories about what it was like on the island and how frightening it was and how terrified he was and what he remembered about literally as an 18-year-old kid, running with his rifle and tripping over limbs and being told to just keep going until he reached the other side. So it's an extraordinary trip. You go to Guam first, and then you fly into Iwo Jima, and as you drop below the clouds, you start to see Mount Suribachi, which of course is where the famous flag raising happened. And everyone just people were chatting on the plane. It was sort of a happy feeling on the plane until we dropped below the clouds and we saw Mount Suribachi, and then it went completely silent. And you could just feel, but these men are so remarkable in their 90s, making this trip. And their energy was just infectious. And I absolutely loved the time that I got to spend with them.
Well, let's talk about some of them, because one of the things I loved watching after the book came out was just the outpouring of gratitude to you for writing the book and for telling the stories. You have to read the book all the way to the end, because when you tell the stories about all of the characters that we meet throughout the book, it's just beautiful writing, masterful writing, I think. But you hear from them, and you brought some of the letters.
I've kept in touch with a lot of people. Charlie Gubish and George Coburn and I keep in touch over time. But one of the things that's been really remarkable is just the outpouring of letters from people who were tangentially involved in the Pacific, and just how it resonates with them. So I get these lovely letters, and some of them are just sort of sweet and funny. This is Leon Wallace from Burlington, New Jersey. He said, Ms. MacCallum, thank you for writing this book. I write because one person mentioned in your book, Harry Gray, reminds me of myself and why I feel blessed. I'm from a little town, Hudson, New York. It's a few miles north of Peekskill on the Hudson. That's where my mother grew up. He said, I too wanted to go to the Marines like Harry. So on my 17th birthday, I took the train to Albany and enlisted. I was turned down because I'm colorblind. I was upset about it. I say it was a blessing because at the time, the Japanese were good at camouflage, so they needed men who could detect colors. They'd not had a lot of jungle fighting yet, so I figure I would be dead. So I joined the Seabees instead. The Seabees and the Marines were close, so like Harry, it could very well have been me, along with Harry, except for being colorblind. I just wanted to tell you this story about my being a lot like Harry. Lee Wallace.
That's lovely.
So, and even from sons and, members of families who write and just send the letters that they have from their loved ones as well, and just wonderful. This account is actually from Europe, from the European theater, and this young man was written up in the paper because he wrote to his family that he had been given the Bronze Star. And he says how he tells his parents how excited he was and what a beautiful ceremony it was, and they gave him a new uniform and the Bronze Star and new shoes. And he says, all my buddies and the troop commander are as happy as me. Well, that's enough of that. But 2 years ago, when I was training in the States, I never thought this would happen to me. I never thought I'd be knocking out German machine guns and getting decorations for it. So I guess I haven't done too badly as a soldier. All those ceremonies mean a lot to a fellow and make him happy, but nothing will make me any more happy than when I get back there on good old Walnut Street with the family, having those good times all over again. There never will be a place nicer. I am sending the Bronze Star Medal to you, Mom, and you, Dad. You can have it. I certainly owe you a lot, and maybe someday I can help you out. I'll never be able to do for you what you have done for me. I am always thinking of you. Tell everyone I said hello. Be good and God bless you always. Your loving son, Art.
Wow.
From the Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania Morning Press. So, I'm so honored actually by the letters that people send to me, and I want everyone to know that I read them all, and I have a big box of them at home, and a lot of them move me to tears, which is not hard to do when I'm working on these things.
You ask your children to read them, and I thought in the time we have remaining, this generation of World War II veterans, many of them are in their 90s now. We're losing their memories. You've helped solidify some of these memories. You've met so many of these veterans, and what are the characteristics of that generation that stick out to you?
Well, I think you can hear it in that letter. It's the humility. I think that's the word that describes them more than anything. They love their country. They wanted to serve their country. They wanted to beat back the enemy that threatened our way of life. I mean, no one is more responsible for the life that we live right now than the veterans of World War II. Because we would have lived a very different life. So I think the humility that you hear in that letter where, he's so happy and proud that he's been able to do all of these heroic things, but he just wants to get home and be with everybody. And the other thing that is always a common thread is that pain of having survived. There's a lot of survivor's guilt and a lot of thinking about the other men that didn't survive. I remember Rondo Sharf, who's a good friend now, who was 16. He faked his papers to go over, and he ended up driving a Higgins boat onto the island of Iwo Jima at 16. It hit an obstruction under the water, which usually they would clear the night before, but one of them they missed, and the boat hit, and they lost 14 men on his Higgins boat, and the steering wheel basically cut into his sternum, and he was, taken to the hospital. But he said, the guys that I lost, he said, sometimes I dream that I see them, and I want them to come to life for just the weekend. I just want to give them the weekend, and so they can live like I did. He said, I got to have a wife and children, and I just want them to have a little taste of it, but then they have to go back because I want to stay here.
President George H.W. Bush was the same. He said that never a day went by when he didn't think of the men that were lost when his flight. Unfortunately, he had that accident there, or that was shot down. Okay, so you're a student of history, obviously. The people watching here, the Great Reagan Library, love history. Is there another period of history you're interested in that you might, I know this was a big project, but do you have another project in you?
I'm becoming more interested in the Korean War. I think it's another area that is not written about a lot. And I'm just sort of beginning to learn a little bit more about that. So that's definitely a time period that intrigues me as well. And I think we're getting to the point where a lot of those men are also getting on in years, and I think that we need to understand a little bit more about their sacrifice. So that's something that, I have a few things that I'm kind of poking around at right now. I also was, just so impacted myself by 9/11, just living in this area. And I think that that's another time period that I want, and, one of my biggest motivators for writing the book was my kids and wanting them to document this story of our family and other families. And, that's one of the reasons that I do pull some of the letters out and I read them to the kids at dinner once in a while, just because I want them to hear these amazing letters from these people. But 9/11 had an enormous impact on us. And I feel like it's getting far enough away now that we need to be reminded of the sacrifice that those people made with no intention other than just going to work in the morning that day.
You named your son Harry.
I did, yeah.
What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I always loved the name Harry Gray, and I never knew him, obviously, but I wanted that name to carry on, and I think it would, I know it made my mother very happy, and his sister, who's still alive, to have someone named for him, because he had such a short life, so it's nice to have that continue on. And Harry loved the book, it definitely hit home for him.
I bet. Well, you're an amazing anchor of the story. You told a tremendous story. I couldn't recommend this book enough. as I said, it stuck with me also. My husband, Peter McMahon, he read it. He loves World War II history, and he had to write to Martha and say, this really was an excellent
Well, I was nervous when Peter was reading it because I know he is a World War II buff. So I thought, oh gosh, I hope he likes it.
You
so
did
I
a
was
great
so
job.
happy that
your
he did.
book came out in the middle of right at the beginning of the pandemic, so you weren't able to travel for book tours, but maybe you'll be able to get out to the Reagan Library.
Oh, I hope so. I would love to do that at some point and be with everybody there. And it's such a fantastic spot. So I do hope that that maybe we can do something in person sometime. But I'm so happy to be able to spend some time.
Well, I'd love to join you there.
Thank you so
Maybe
much
we'll
for
do
doing
it
this.
together there
that
too.
That would be so fun.
Make this a bi-coastal thing.
Invite
Thank you,
us.
Martha.
We'll come.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
February 1945. World War II had been raging for nearly 6 years. U.S. forces battled across the Stepping Stone Islands, inching closer to mainland Japan.
Ahead now stood Iwo Jima, the most heavily fortified island in the world.
On the brink of battle, Kurabayashi watched the sea from his command post, waiting for the attack.
They're going on the toughest assignment of Marine Corps history.
We were all jacked up, you know. Most of us couldn't figure out why we were taking that wee little place and why we needed so many Marines to do it.
"24 hours after the battle began, more than 500 Americans were dead and nearly 2,000 wounded.
There was an odor of death on the island.
We thought they were Japs laying on a pile covered with ponchos. They weren't Japs, they were Marines.
The commanding officer asked me, as the only flamethrower operator left, could I do something about some of these pillboxes that had us stalled? My remark was, I'll try.
In the 34th replacement draft,
Right.
is this someone that you recognize?
Oh yeah, that was my buddy, Gray. I think his name was Gray.
He was my uncle.
He was my buddy, a foxhole buddy. He'd always call me Pop.
I ended up buddy more with Harry. Thank God we had each other, you know. We were laying in a crater, me and Harry. He gave me a quick hug and he took off. 'Cause that's the night that we had an awful mortar attack. One of them landed right between Harry and the kid next to him. Killed both of them. And I went over and I wanted to kick him, like, why did you do this? You know, don't you know I love you? I never saw him again.
"75 years have passed since the last days of World War II. Lives have been lived, children and grandchildren born. But when the men of Iwo Jima reflect, they still wonder sometimes why they were spared and others were not.
What we had to do to keep our country free.
Thank you for joining us for today's virtual programming event. We hope this conversation has inspired you to share what you've learned with your family and friends, and that you'll join us again for an upcoming event.
And let me offer lesson number 1 about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.